Hello, this is our first recording of evolution, and we will start by defining evolution. Now, evolution, as you see on the screen, is the change in allele frequency in a population. For example, if we have a certain allele that is dominant or recessive and that has a certain frequency, like 60%, for example, in the population, meaning that this allele is present in the gene pool of 60% of the living organisms, and then for a reason or another and over a long period of time, that frequency of that allele has been diminished, for example, to 20%. Then we have a change, and that change is in the frequency of a particular allele. And by frequency here, we mean the percentage of that allele, whether recessive or dominant. And evolution is considered at the level of the population, meaning that we cannot consider evolution at the level of one individual or one organism. I'm so sorry, I apologize because I have a very bad cold, but I had to send the recording. So you will have to withstand my voice throughout the recording. I'm so sorry. Now, so evolution is a change. Evolution is a change in allele frequency, and evolution is considered at the level of the population. And that change in allele frequency occurs over a long period of time, as we will be seeing later on, over a long period of time, and therefore it is a slow change, it is a gradual change, and most importantly, it is a cumulative change, because we will see later on that evolution results from the accumulation of certain changes in the population, like successive mutations, for example. Okay? I'll pause for a minute to see why the screen has changed color. Okay. Now, as we said, evolution usually occurs very slowly, but this also depends upon the rate of reproduction of a certain species and the rate of occurrence of mutations in that species. For example, certain populations might unexpectedly evolve very rapidly, and this occurs when they reproduce rapidly and they mutate rapidly. So if they reproduce rapidly, meaning that their life cycle is short, and if they mutate frequently, because mutation is the raw material of the change that occurs in the population, like, for example, in bacteria. Because bacteria have a very short life cycle, because they reproduce rapidly, because they mutate frequently, then certain mutant strains develop new properties, as you know, like being antibiotic resistant. And as you know, resistance against antibiotics is a characteristic that is determined by a gene, and that gene is carried on a certain plasmid, which we call the R plasmid, as you know from your study of molecular biology. Now, it's a good opportunity to say that mutation is the raw material of change. Mutation is the raw material of change. Of course, it's not the only cause of change, but it is one very important factor in change. Mutation is the raw material of change. But the norm, like in human beings and in animals, in higher animals, that evolution takes place gradually, as we said, over hundreds or even thousands or even millions of years. Of course, there are several theories of evolution that themselves evolved from one level of correctness to another higher level of accuracy and truth. But some of these evolution theories were based just on observation, and others were based on experimental studies. But it's worth noting that when we say that a certain scientist, like Darwin, for example, is a naturalist, meaning that it is a scientist who is interested in what we call natural history. A natural history is a branch of science that helps you study animals in their natural environments, and that is based only or mainly on observation rather than on experimentation. So, natural history studies animals in their natural environments, meaning that we are not going to transfer the animals, for example, to the lab to study their behavior. And the second important property of natural history is that it depends mainly on observation rather than on experimentation. Now, in order to study the history of Earth, there are several tools that were used by scientists. And the first important field of study in the study of the history of Earth is dating, meaning that scientists wanted to know how long has life been on Earth, and moreover, they wanted to know the age of the Earth. And they used two main methods to date or to know the age of Earth. The first one was the relative method, and the second one was the absolute method. Or actually, they are methods. So there are a group of tools that are categorized as being relative methods and others that were categorized as being absolute methods. Both relative methods and absolute methods were mainly used to determine the age of rocks as well as the age of fossils inside these rocks. You know that buried inside the rocks, there are fossils of animals, fossils of bacteria, fossils of plants. And if we know the age of a rock and there is a fossil that is embedded in that rock, then we can know the age of that fossil. And if you know the age of the oldest rock on Earth, then you might have an approximate idea about the age of the Earth itself. Okay, I just want to make sure that I'm recording. Okay. The first methods are the relative methods, meaning that in the relative methods, we are not going to determine the exact age of a rock or the exact age of a fossil, but we are going to compare the ages of several layers. Because it is well known, for example, that there are different types of rocks on Earth. And one of the most famous types of rocks that are used for dating are the sedimentary rocks. Sedimentary comes from sedimentation, and sedimentation means precipitation or laying down. So sedimentation depends on the idea of precipitation or bedding or laying down. What is precipitated are the weathered rocks, because you know that when a rock is exposed to weather and to erosion by wind or by rain, there are particles of that rock that are separated. Small particles of that rock are separated, and then they go elsewhere and become deposited elsewhere. And because of the variable nature of those particles, they form distinct layers that are even sometimes having different colors and different consistency, of course. But the most important for dating is that there is a general rule that the lowermost are the oldest. So the lowermost are the oldest, and the uppermost are the most recent or the youngest. So if we have those layers A, B, C, D, E, F, then F is the youngest or the most recent, and A is the oldest. And therefore, if you have a certain fossil here, then definitely that fossil was present much earlier than another fossil that is buried in layer F. This is a good way to know the relative duration of the rocks on Earth or the rock layers on Earth, and therefore the relative duration of the fossils, because any sedimentary layer that contains a particular type of rock will, I don't say that it will have the same age as that of the fossil, but in other words, I would rather say that all fossils that are buried in a particular sedimentary layer will have appeared on Earth more or less in the same epoch or in the same era. Now, the other methods are, or the other groups of methods are the absolute methods. And in the absolute methods, we determine the exact age of the substance, of the fossil or of the rock. And it is based on the decay of radioactive isotopes. And you know that every radioactive material has a half-life, and it is the time that is needed for half of the radioactive material to be converted into a non-radioactive material, as we're going to see on the next slides. And that's why, because this dating method, we've just said that dating means that we want to know the age of the layer or the age of the rock or the age of the fossil, and it is radiometric because we are using a radioactive substance. The radiometric dating is an accurate method of determination of age of the rocks. So this is the benefit or the advantage, but the drawback is that sometimes in a particular rock, you don't have enough fossils to do this, and therefore there should be other methods. Now, this diagram shows you how radioactive materials can be used for dating. For example, uranium 238. One second, I'll pause. Hello again. So, for example, uranium 238 takes about 4.5 million years in order for half of the uranium 238, which is radioactive, to be converted into non-radioactive lead 206. Of course, this necessitates that the nucleus of uranium 238 emits helium nuclei that contain 2 neutrons and 2 protons and electrons, in order for it to be converted into lead-206. So uranium-238 is a radioactive material. What is a radioactive material? What are the characteristics of a radioactive material? A radioactive material is an unstable element, and it is unstable because the nucleus of that radioactive element contains an extra neutron or contains an extra proton. And in order for these extra neutrons or extra protons to stay in the nucleus, the nucleus contains more energy than normal, and therefore there is tendency for the nucleus to decay and to release particles from the nucleus. And therefore, when those particles are released, the element is converted gradually into another element, and that other element is non-radioactive. The time needed for this to occur, for half this mass of uranium-238 to be converted into lead-206, is 4.5 million years. But the half-life may differ from one radioactive element to another. For example, uranium-235 takes 713 million years for half of its mass to be converted into lead-207, and thorium-232 takes about 13 trillion years, or 14 actually billion years, in order for half of its mass to be converted into lead-209. See, of course, that we have started by different elements, and we have ended up after the half-life by having half their masses been converted into different non-radioactive elements. Similarly, plutonium-241, half of it is converted into bismuth-209 in about 2,400,000 years. So here, for example, when we say that 1 unit of radioactive uranium-238 takes about 4.5 billion years in order for half of the original unit of this radioactive uranium to be converted into another non-radioactive material, then we can say that the half-life of uranium-238 equals 400.5 billion years, or 4.5 times 10 to the power 9 years. And if this is true, then in order for half, the remaining half, to be converted into the non-radioactive material, we need another half-life. So after another 4.5 billion years, you will have half of the half, meaning 1/4 of the original unit. Now, other techniques for measuring the age of Earth include paleomagnetic dating. And paleomagnetic dating depends on the fact that the Earth's magnetic poles shift. You know that Earth acts like a huge magnet, having a North Pole and a South Pole. And there is a shift that occurs in the magnetic poles of the Earth. And this is affecting mainly some rocks that contain magnetite. You know that when there are volcanoes, there is lava that is released from those volcanoes. And the lava is very hot at the beginning, and then the lava cools down. And when it cools down, it forms rocks. Those rocks contain magnetite, and magnetite is affected by the changes in the magnetic poles of the Earth. So as the magnetic poles of the Earth change, magnetite in rocks changes its direction and is used as a recording for the changes that occurred in the magnetic poles of the Earth. So this is another way of knowing, of studying Earth in general, and some very specialized scientists may use this in order not only to detect the movements and the shifts in the magnetic poles of the Earth, but also to know the age of such rocks. There are other types of measurement that are called the molecular clocks. And since they are called molecular clocks, then they determine time, and at the same time, they depend upon molecules. And actually, they depend upon the mutation rate of certain molecules, like the DNA molecules, for example, to deduce the time when two life forms diverged, meaning that if I have a certain ancestor that I'll call A1, and then a mutation occurred in some of the members of that ancestor, so some new species will develop, or some new organisms will develop, and gradually they might form a new species. So most individuals will continue similar to, or will be similar to A1, but there will be mutant organisms A2. They might be selected for and form a new species in different environments, for example. So every time a mutation occurs along development, there will be a new species that will diverge from the original species. And by knowing the rate at which a specific type of biological molecule undergoes mutation, and by counting the number of new species that have developed from the original ancestral species, then we can approximately determine the age. For example, if along history, for example, there was an ancestor A1, and then we had a mutation resulting in a new species here that we will call 2, and then another mutation uh, resulting in a new species 3, and then a fourth mutation. And if we know that every mutation takes X time to develop, so in order to reach species 4 from species 1, we needed time equal to 3x. Of course, this is a very oversimplification. This is an oversimplification, but it just indicates you how to use or scientists use the molecular clocks. One of the important aspects of measurement of the history of Earth is measurement of continental drifts. Of course, we will be talking about continental drifts in detail, but we are going here to talk about how to use laser in order to laser rays, for example, in order to determine the distance between 2 points. So if you have point A and point B, and here you put a reflector, and here you put the source of laser, and you calculate the time that is needed for that laser to travel and then be reflected back. And through calculation of that time, or actually through measurement of that time, you can calculate the distance between the 2 points. And this is used in order to determine the distances between 2 points on Earth. And we'll be seeing later on what continental drifts are and how we can use this in measuring continental drifts. Of course, you know that laser is a monochromatic light, meaning that it consists of monochromatic light. It consists of wavelengths it consists of electromagnetic radiation or electromagnetic waves that have the same wavelength and therefore that have the same color. So they are monochromatic and they are coherent. Coherent means that they have the same phase, meaning that the waves reach the peaks at the same time. So all the waves are coherent, meaning that they reach their peaks at the same time. And that's why, and they have the same wavelength. They have the same wavelength, and therefore they are all in phase. And because they are all in phase, this is what allows a laser beam to be highly focused and to have a very high energy. So laser consists of electromagnetic waves that are monochromatic, meaning that they have the same wavelength, they are coherent, they are in phase, and that's why they are highly focused. Amongst the studies of history of Earth, scientists also study the changes in sea levels. Of course, this introduction seems a bit broad or confusing, but it's just an introduction, and every item of these might or not be used later on or re-explained later on in more details, but it's just a broad idea, not only of dating rocks and fossils, but of studying the natural history of Earth in general. Now, changes in sea levels, of course, you know, sorry, that sea levels might be more elevated or less elevated depending upon many factors. For example, depending upon the global temperature, if there is global warming, if there is elevation of the Earth's temperature, then there would be melting of more ice at the poles and elevation of the sea level. Of course, we will see how changes in sea levels might lead to flooding, for example, of deltas or inundation of deltas. And inundation means flooding of deltas. Why are we talking about flooding of deltas in particular? Because deltas of rivers are usually lower in level than the sea level, and therefore they might be flooded or inundated by seawater if the sea level is elevated, and this would lead to erosion of the sand, for example, on the beaches. It might also change the Earth's crust, as we might be studying later on. By employing all these methods, scientists have deduced that Earth has changed a lot since it has been created. And scientists estimate the age of Earth as being equal to 4.5 billion years ago. And that the continents that were originally present on Earth were different from those that are present now. There were times in the life of Earth when those continents were continuous with each other. Some continents has shifted in position, and the climate has changed from extreme cooling to extreme warming in different eras of the Earth's history. The oceans have risen and lowered repeatedly, so nothing was actually stagnant or constant in the history of Earth. Everything has changed a lot. There was recurrent volcanic activity, and you know that volcanoes, of course, when lava comes out of volcanoes with this very high temperature, it might result in drastic changes on the surface of the Earth, and it might kill off a huge number of species that are now considered extinct species, meaning that they no more exist on the surface of Earth. So volcanic activity is one of the factors that resulted. We have on the previous slide, we talked about global warming. This is one of the factors that resulted in drastic changes in the natural history of Earth. We have volcanic activity that also resulted in extinction of many species. we also have meteorites. And you know that meteorites are rocks that come from the space, the outer space of the Earth, and that bombard the Earth from the outer space. And it is being said that it is meteorites are one of the reasons why dinosaurs have been extincted from the surface of the Earth. And at the same time, once dinosaurs disappeared, mammals had a chance to expand around the Earth. There were, along the history of Earth, along the natural history of Earth, there have been 5 major extinctions. And the last extinction is being recorded to have occurred 65 million years ago. It is also being said by scientists that 4 billion years ago, there was no free oxygen in the atmosphere of the Earth, and that all organisms that were living on Earth at the time were anaerobes, meaning that they could live in the absence of oxygen. Of course, you know that anaerobes are of two types. There are obligate anaerobes that cannot live in the presence of oxygen, and there are facultative anaerobes that essentially live in the absence of oxygen, but if oxygen is present, they can adapt and they can live in the presence of oxygen. At a certain point in the natural history of Earth, cyanobacteria have developed. And cyanobacteria, as you know, are colored bacteria. Cyano, they contain a purplish or a bluish pigment that can photosynthesize. And therefore, cyanobacteria are considered oxygen generating organisms because they photosynthesize and they produce oxygen through the process of photosynthesis. And therefore, cyanobacteria that lived in oceans and that lived on the surface of the seashores provided free oxygen for organisms that lived in the seawater and for organisms that lived on the surface of the earth. And those cyanobacteria form rock-like structures that are called stromatolites, or stromatoliths, and these are rocks that are made of particles of sand that are glued together by a gluey substance that is secreted by the cyanobacteria. And so they are a very specific type of rocks that is induced or whose formation is induced by cyanobacteria. And cyanobacteria are usually found on the surface of those rocks. Okay? When oxygen has been formed for the first time on the surface of or in the atmosphere, in the space around the Earth, it killed off most anaerobes. And now we know that those anaerobes are obligate anaerobes because since they couldn't withstand the presence of oxygen, then they are obligate anaerobes. And they were prokaryotic obligate anaerobes. And since they are obligate anaerobes, then oxygen is toxic to them. Okay? So only the facultative anaerobes that are essentially anaerobes but that can withstand the presence of oxygen could survive. And at the same time, of course, this gave a great opportunity for aerobes to flourish and develop. But of course, there is no clear interpretation for how aerobes developed, since most of the naturalists do not believe in the creation of organisms as they are, but they rather believe in the evolution from a common ancestor. So they didn't tell us how aerobes have been developed. We know that there were anaerobes and that most of them were killed. Were there a few aerobes that flourished um, upon the development of cyanobacteria and the accumulation of oxygen on the surface of Earth? From their point of view, maybe, but we believe in the presence of creation of specific organisms, meaning that every organism has been created as it is. Human beings have been created as they are. Prokaryotes have been created as they are. There are similarities in between the organisms, that's true, but that similarity does not, from our point of view, indicate a common ancestor, but they indicate a common creator. Anyways, what we are studying here is the point of view of scientists as from their perspective, of course. This high level of oxygen resulted in a rapid diversification of life on land because now life is not restricted to anaerobes, but life has been expanded in order to include the aerobes. And there was a short period known as the Cambrian explosion, that is about 500 million years ago, that was characterized by the sudden appearance of many actual phyla or groups of animals. I'll pause for a minute. Now, we are going to study something very important, which is the evidence for evolution. You're frequently asked about the pieces of evidence to prove that evolution has occurred. And by the way, our belief that there is a creator for this universe who created every species as it is does not mean that we do not believe in many of the aspects of evolution that were mentioned by scientists and um, that are explained here in the PowerPoint presentation or in your curriculum. But there are, of course, certain points we don't agree with. Now, the first evidence for the occurrence of evolution is the presence of the fossil record. The fossil record is a documentation of the fossils that have been found in the layers, in the different sediments or sedimentary layers of Earth. And it proved that certain fossils have been, or certain fossils have been found that are no more existent nowadays, and therefore they became extinct, whereas other ones have gradually evolved to result in the emergence of new species. From those fossil records, scientists have learned that prokaryotes were the first organisms to develop on Earth, meaning that they were even for our belief of creation, then according to the scientists' hypothesis, prokaryotes have been created first. Anyways, they have been present on Earth first, and they are the oldest fossils. And you might be wondering how we can find prokaryotic fossils like bacteria. Of course, these are microscopic fossils, meaning that you can see them only using a microscope. Paleontologists who study the fossils have discovered many transitional forms. The transitional fossils are fossils that link two species, an older species with a newer one. For example, in the history, the natural history of horses, for example, there was transition from the Eohippus to the modern horse, which is the Equus. So the all the stages in between that we are going to see on the next slide are called transitional forms in the natural history of a horse. Similarly, there are other transitional forms that actually link two different species, like the Archaeopteryx, for example. The Archaeopteryx is a fossil that links reptiles and birds, or has characteristics of reptiles and characteristics of birds. So, for example, it has a long tail like reptiles, and it has feathers like birds. Of course, feathers do not stay in the fossil, but you can see the imprint on feathers on a rock, for example, like we're going to see on some of the pictures. And of course, all this paleontologic study, or the study of the fossils, have shown us that the species that live nowadays are only a small fraction of the species that have lived along the natural history of Earth. Now, here we can see the evolution of the horse, and therefore the Eohippus is the oldest form of the horse, and the most recent form of the horse is called the Equus. And in between them, the Oligohippus and the Merychippus or Merychippus and the Pliohippus, all these are considered transitional forms. So the Oligohippus and the Merychippus and the Pliohippus are all considered transitional forms. You needn't, of course, memorize the names of the transitional forms, but you should know the Eohippus and the Equus, and any other name that will be mentioned will be a transitional form of the horse. And here you can see the Archaeopteryx, and you can see this is how the scientists imagined the Archaeopteryx. Of course, they didn't see it, but they could imagine how it looked like from the fossil. So this is the fossil. And of course, you know that the fossil is not necessarily the remains of the organism itself, but the fossil might be the traces or the imprints or the prints of the organism on the rocks, as you can see here. So this is how the Archaeopteryx looks like, or how the scientists imagined the Archaeopteryx to look like. I'm sorry, I'm going to charge my laptop. And oops, I'm sorry. It's a good opportunity to see all the slides of evolution at the same time. Okay. So you can see from the diagram that the Archaeopteryx has a beak like birds, and at the same time it has a long tail like reptiles. Okay, let's move on. I'll just stop sharing and make sure that everything is okay after all the trouble that occurred. Just make sure that we are recording. Okay. Now, the second evidence for evolution is the comparative anatomy, meaning that we are comparing anatomical structure of different living organisms. And in this field, we have three important terms to remember: the homologous structures, the analogous structures, and the vestigial structures. Examples of homologous structures include the wing of a bat, for example, the fins of a whale. So here we have the wing of a bat, we have the fins of a whale, we have the limbs in a cat, or the limbs in a human being. All these structures apparently are different. Their external appearance is different. So wings are totally different from fins, and fins are totally different from the limbs of mammals. But if you focus inside, you will find that the basic anatomical structure inside, which is made of bones, or the skeleton, is the same. So here, for example, this is the humerus in the human body, and you have a similar bone here, a similar bone there, and there. So if we call this H, for example, then we will have H here, and H there. And then we have the radius, for example, the bone that is called the radius here in human beings, R. So you have an R here, you have an R there, and you have an R here, and so on. The ulna here, the U, so you have ulna, and you have ulna, and you have ulna. Okay. And then we have the phalanges that are colored brown. These are called homologous structures. So they have the same internal bone structure, but it is the function of each that varies. For example, the wing of a bat helps it fly, the fins of a whale help it swim, and the limbs of a mammal help it walk. So they are called homologous structures, and scientists have concluded that these animals who have homologous structures have a common origin and therefore a common ancestry. On the other hand, we have the analogous structures. Analogous structures are the opposite, meaning that the function is the same, but the structure is totally different. For example, a bat's wing and a fly's wing. If we look at here, for example, we have three animals. We have the pterosaurs that are extinct flying reptiles. You see, pterosaurs is similar to dinosaurs, so they are extinct reptiles, but scientists think that those reptiles were flying reptiles. We have the bats and we have the birds. So this is a bat and that is a bird because we have feathers here. So we have three wings, but the inner structure is totally different. So they carry out the same function. They are all wings, and they all help the same function, which is flying, but their inner structure or their anatomical structure is different. And scientists have explained this on the basis of the environment, meaning that these different species have been exposed to the same environment. They have been exposed to the same environment, which is air, and they had to carry out the same function, which is flying. And only those species that could fly or that had the ability to fly were selected for in that environment. And that's why they ended up by having the same function. Actually, what the environment did here is not to create the function, but what the environment did here, and this is very important, is to select for those variants that could fly, those variants that could fly, and of course, to select against the other variants that could not fly. Say, for example, amongst the reptiles, we had 90% of the reptiles that cannot fly or couldn't fly at the time. And only 10%, like the pterosaurs, are mutated, are mutants, and those mutants could fly. Okay? So those 90% that cannot fly were selected for on Earth. They were the ones that could survive on Earth. The others that could fly tried to fly, and they succeeded. So in the air, in the higher layers of the air, they were the ones that were selected for. If any of the 90% reptiles tried to fly, it would be killed because it is not mutated. It does not have the properties that are in the mutant forms that help them fly. So this is the basis of evolution, according to Darwin, according to the most recent theory, that in every species there are variants, like the 90% that cannot fly and the 10% that can fly. When they are put in the same environment, on Earth, the 90% will flourish. But in air, it is the 10% mutants that will flourish or that will succeed and reproduce and stay alive. And therefore, again, the environmental pressures do not create a mutant species, but they select for or select against a certain species and or a certain variant of the species, actually. And we're going to study this in detail, of course, in Darwin's theory. As an evidence of evolution, we also have the vestigial structures. And the vestigial structures are structures that became smaller or atrophic because they're not used. For example, the appendix. So in human beings, for example, the appendix is very small because the most important function of the appendix is to digest cellulose, okay? And to secrete cellulase enzyme that digests cellulose. So in animals that eat plenty of herbs and grasses, we will find that this appendix is well developed. In human beings, in recent human beings, the appendix is atrophic, meaning that it diminished in size because it's not being used. It's true that we eat vegetables that contain cellulose, but not like rabbits, for example, or zebras, or koalas, or kangaroos, or opossums, that are all animals. Of course, you know the rabbit and the zebra, the koala, and the opossum are mammals that look like a small fox or a small animals. And of course, you know the kangaroos. Now, the third evidence for evolution is the comparative embryology. Scientists have found that during embryonic development, all vertebrates have similar stages. For example, they all have gill pouches, structures that are called gill pouch. A pouch is like a depression. A pouch is like a depression. So they all have gill pouches at a certain stage of early embryonic development. But later on, in fish, for example, those gill pouches will be converted into or will develop into gills. Whereas in mammals, the gill pouches will develop into eustachian tubes. And the eustachian tubes are actually a cartilaginous tube that connects the middle ear with the nasopharynx. So if this is your mouth, and this is your ear, then you have the eardrum here in the middle between the external ear and the middle ear. And the mouth is connected to the outside air, and the external ear is connected to the outside air. So in order to equalize pressure on both sides of the eardrum, this is the eardrum, there is a tube that connects the middle ear and the nasopharynx, actually, and therefore the mouth cavity. Of course, the eustachian tube might be blocked when you go to high altitudes in airplanes, and that's why you have to chew gum in order to open the eustachian tube and to keep that balance between the external air outside the ear and the air in the mouth cavity or in the nasopharynx. Now, this is a diagram of the embryos at different stages. And we can see here, for example, the fish, and then we have the salamander, and the tortoise that are amphibians. And then we have the birds. And then we have lower mammals like the rabbits and higher mammals like man. At the beginning, they all have the gill slits or the gill pouches. Later on, in fish, the gill slits are converted into actual gills, okay, actual gills. But in human beings, the gill slits will be converted into the eustachian tube that, of course, we don't see on the slide, but other characteristics will develop. For example, in fish, we will have fins, and in human beings, we will have limbs. So this early embryonic stage, where all early embryos, these are early embryos, had gill pouches or gill slits, is taken by scientists as an evidence of common ancestry. And then number 5, we have comparative biochemistry, meaning that one of the pieces of evidence of evolution that there are certain biochemical pathways that are common between living organisms, and that might, from the point of view of naturalists, indicate a common ancestor. And of course, the more closely related the two organisms, the more similar their biochemistry is. So for example, if we are studying a certain polypeptide in different organisms, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we find that this polypeptide, the amino acid analysis or sequencing in that polypeptide indicated that the polypeptide in species 3 and 4 is very close and very different from that of species 1, 2, and 5. Therefore, 3 and 4 might have a common ancestor. For example, human beings and mice are mammals. And because there is a great relationship in their biochemistry, that's why we use mice and guinea pigs in order to do experiments to try medication, for example, before using them on patients and before releasing them in the market on a commercial basis. For example, we know that cytochrome C is one of the electron carriers in the electron transport chain in cellular respiration and in photosynthesis. And since it is present in cellular respiration, then it is present in all aerobic organisms, and it is also present in all autotrophic organisms that can photosynthesize. So cytochrome C is a good molecule to study comparative biochemistry and therefore to study the relationship between living organisms. Why? Because you will find it in every organism that is aerobic, or you will find it that every organism that is autotrophic. You cannot use a molecule to study, to compare species together, while that molecule is present only in a few species on Earth. When you know the ancestral relationships between living organisms based on your analysis of a certain polypeptide like cytochrome C, you can draw a cladogram. And a cladogram is like a tree that shows you the ancestral relationship between living organisms. And from the study of the amino acid sequence of cytochrome C in living organisms, scientists have discovered that humans and chimpanzees are almost identical in many of the polypeptides, especially cytochrome C. And then we have number 5, evidence number 5 is biogeography. And biogeography is the study of how living organisms are distributed in different geographic areas of the Earth. And there is an important theory that is called the theory of plate tectonics that explains how living organisms are present on different areas of the earth, or that explains why a particular organism is present in a certain area and why another organism is not present in that area. So what is tectonics? Tectonics is the scientific study of the deformities that occur in the rocks of the earth. So tectonics is a science, and that science, tectonics, the word tectonics, it's a science that studies the deformations that occur in the crust of the earth. And it also studies not only the deformation that occurs, but it studies the factors that lead to that deformation. What is the crust of the earth? If we look here, we will find that we have the layers of the earth. We have a crust, an outer crust, and then we have a mantle, a hot mantle, and then an outer core and an inner core, okay? And the outer crust is not continuous. The outer crust is made of plates that we call the tectonic plates, okay? So the mantle is liquid or semi-solid, so currents in the mantle are responsible for that slow continuous movement of the plates that results in shifts of the positions of the continents, which we call the continental drift. So if you have, for example, if we consider a certain area of the earth, a large, of course, surface area of the earth, and we have two plates, for example, that have a small space in between them, and under them we have the mantle, and this is the crust. These are the crust plates. These are the crust plates, and underneath we have the mantle, and the mantle is not solid, and therefore there are currents in the mantle, there are movements in the mantle that result in continental drifts or drifts of the plates of the crust of the earth. And it is being said or assumed that the North American plate has drifted northwestward, meaning north means towards the north and west means towards the west. So north westward, this is the direction of northwest. And while shifting northwestward, it is pulled away from the Eurasian plate, because if this is, for example, North America, and here we have Europe, so there is a shift of about 2 centimeters per year northwestward. This is what we call continental drift. Sometimes continental drift results in the formation of mountains. So first of all, we have the mantle that results in drifts of the continents, and we have seen the example of North America that is drifted 2 centimeters northwestward per year. But sometimes this drift results in the formation of mountains. When does it occur? When the two plates drift towards each other. So here, in the example of North America, they were drifting away from each other. But here, they are drifting towards each other. So when they drift towards each other, they collide. So what happens when they collide? If you have, for example, this is the plate to the right, which is plate 2, and then plate 1 moves towards plate 2 and collides with it. So when it collides with it, it hits it and gets at a higher level, and it is raised to a higher level. So it appears like this. So we will have plate 1 that will be at a higher level than plate 2. And this is one of the ways mountains are formed. So continental drifts occur, but also mountains are formed because of those drifts. So tectonics, as you see in the last paragraph, is the study of the deformation of the rocks that make up the Earth's crust and the study of the factors that lead to this deformation. And what I've just said about the formation of mountains can be used as an explanation for how the Himalayan mountains have been formed, because the Indian plate collided with the Eurasian plate. So if this is the Indian plate, it is the Indian plate that collided, and it is at a lower level than the Eurasian plate, and the Himalayan mountains have been formed at this place. Okay? So this cumulative effect of plate movement over millions of years on Earth has changed the flora and fauna of Earth. By flora, we mean the plants. And by fauna, we mean the animals. Okay? So those continental drifts and those tectonic plates that are hitting each other, colliding with each other, with one getting lower and the other getting higher, and the formation of mountain, a fusion of certain plates, separation of other plates, has greatly affected the distribution of animals on Earth. And we will see a very interesting example, which is the example of the Pangaea. The Pangaea is a supercontinent, and that supercontinent has developed 250 million years ago, because at that time, 250 million years ago, there were movements of tectonic plates, and those movements resulted in all the tectonic plates fusing together, and therefore all land on Earth was fused into a big continent, which we call a supercontinent, because it gathered all the tectonic plates on Earth. They were all fused together, and that supercontinent was called Pangaea. Okay, and I think we have a picture of Pangaea. Yes, this is Pangaea. See how Eurasia, which is Europe and Asia, together with North America, South America, Africa, India, Australia, and Antarctica, were all fused into one supercontinent. So this is due to fusion of all plates. So this supercontinent resulted from fusion of all tectonic plates on Earth, of all tectonic plates on Earth. Okay? During that movement, or during that continental drift, sometimes the ocean basins, and by ocean basins we mean the floor of all seas and oceans. So sometimes the ocean bases became lower, like here, for example, and then when they get lower, then the sea level will be more shallow, and there could be an exposure of more sand than normal. And now we are going to study a very important example, which is how, this is a question, how continental drift has changed the distribution of life on Earth. And we have a fact that we want to explain or to justify. And that fact that we want to justify is how marsupials are located exclusively in Australia. Marsupials, like the kangaroos, they are placental mammals, but they are not true placental mammals. Why? Because the embryos are carried in pouches here. It's like a pocket. If this is the animal, then you will have here a pouch or a pocket where the fetus will continue its development. So they have placentas, but they are not true placental mammals. Because true placental mammals, like human beings, for example, true placental mammals, the female has a structure in the uterus that is called the placenta, and there is an umbilical cord that connects the embryo to the placenta, and through which the embryo receives oxygen and blood and nutrition and delivers waste. But the embryo stays in the uterus of the mother for the whole length of pregnancy. And the embryo comes out only when it is full term, when the fetus is full term. But in marsupials, no, part of the embryonic life or the fetal life is spent in the pouch. Those marsupials are present only in Australia, whereas in other continents like Africa, like Europe, we have the eutherians, and the eutherians are true placental mammals, like, for example, cows, like buffaloes, like dogs, like cats. All these are true placental mammals. And the fossil evidence helped us understand why. Marsupials originated essentially in what is now called as Asia, and they reached Australia via South America and Antarctica while the continents were still joined. Okay? So here, for example, we can say that while the continents were still fused together in the Pangaea, so in Asia, we had the marsupials. They first appeared here, and it has been known from the fossils. And then they went to North America, and then to South America, and then to Antarctica, because fossils of them have been found in Antarctica. And then they settled in Australia. Why did they settle in Australia? Because Australia was the best environment for them. So it was helpful to grow, to reproduce safely, and to increase in number. Okay? But later on, separation occurred and the continents broke apart, and every continent had a different climate. And Australia was like a giant raft. It separated, and it carried both marsupials and eutherians. So Australia contained eutherians, and then the marsupials came to it from Eurasia. And in Australia, because the environment was very suitable to them everywhere, so the marsupials filled every available niche, meaning that if Australia is here, if this is Australia, so Australia, for example, had different niches, meaning habitats. Okay, and for example, say that here it is cooler and there it is warmer. So there are certain marsupials that settled here, others that settled there. So they occupied every niche. And this is what we called adaptive radiation, meaning that they diverged and they radiated and finally settled in different areas of Australia, depending on which environment suited them the most. Because those marsupials, it's true that they are all marsupials, but they are diverse. Okay, they include different subtypes, and every subtype settled in a particular habitat in Australia, depending on which habitat was most suitable to them. That's why we call this divergence or this radiation that occurred on the basis of adaptation, we call it adaptive radiation. whereas the placental mammals were extinct, meaning that they all migrated to Australia. They passed from Eurasia to America to Australia, both eutherians and marsupials. Eutherians were extinct and marsupials diversified. And this tells you that after the separation of continents, all the mammals that are present in Australia are now coming from abroad or have been imported from abroad. Okay. And now we're going to talk about the historical context and the efforts of scientists. The first one we're going to talk about is Aristotle. And Aristotle had a theory that is called scala natura. And scala natura means what? Scala means ladder, and natura, of course, like refers to nature. And he arranged all life forms on Earth on a certain scale or ladder of increasing complexity. Okay? And human beings, of course, were at the pinnacle or at the top of that ladder of complexity, and prokaryotes were at the bottom of that ladder of complexity. He also talked about permanence of the species, meaning that, according to Aristotle, he believed that all species were created as they are and stayed as they are. We believe that all species were created as they are now, but we also believe that they have evolved, meaning that over the millions of years they have been on the surface of Earth, there were mutant species that appeared, and that some, or mutant variants that appeared for every species, and that some species have been selected for and other species have been selected against. So Aristotle theory or scala natura was an extreme opposite of the theories of evolution like Darwin's theory. And then we have another scientist who is called Carl Linnaeus, and Carl Linnaeus was specialized in taxonomy, which is the classification of the diverse forms of life. And he he gave names to the animals and to the different living organisms, and it was a binomial nomenclature. For example, human beings, for example, are called Homo sapiens, and the first name is given a capital letter, whereas the other name is not given a capital letter. And we start by the genus name, and then the second name is the species name. So, of course, a genus will be broader than a species. And then we have Cuvier, or Georges Cuvier. And Cuvier died even before Darwin published his thesis on evolution and on the origin of species. The thesis of Darwin was called The Origin of Species. Cuvier studied fossils and realized that every stratum, because we were talking about sedimentary rocks, for example, every stratum has a characteristic fossil. And so this is number one. He realized that each stratum has a different fossil. But he adopted a very strange theory called catastrophism. The theory, of course, was completely wrong or weird, but what is important in Cuvier's work is that his study of fossils served Darwin's theory a lot. What are the postulates, or what is the main postulate of the theory of catastrophism? The theory of catastrophism says that there were organisms in every era of life, and then a catastrophic event occurred, so all the previous species disappeared because of that catastrophe, and new species have evolved. So a series of events in the past occurred suddenly and were caused by mechanisms that are different from those that are present nowadays, and they were responsible for the disappearance of certain species. Maybe catastrophic events result in extinction of certain species, but how can those catastrophic events result in the development of new species? This is what Cuvier did not explain. And then we have another scientist called Hutton that talked about the theory of gradualism. So what was okay about the theory of Hutton is the concept of gradualism. And he talked about the changes on Earth. And this is exactly the opposite of what Cuvier said, because Hutton said that Earth had been molded and changed, but these changes were not sudden, violent, catastrophic events, like Cuvier said, but they were, on the other hand, slow and gradual changes, like wind, for example, like weather, like a flow of water, and that these changes, slow, gradual changes, were responsible for the formation of all the molding that we see on the surface of Earth, like the mountain ranges and the canyons, for example. And then we have Charles Lyell, and Charles Lyell is important because he was a leading geologist and he lived at the same time as Darwin. And he also talked about geological changes, changes in the Earth's layers that resulted from slow, continuous actions, meaning that Charles Lyell talked about gradual changes. Okay. And then we have Lamarck, and Lamarck's theory is important, although it's not correct, but it is important. Lamarck also lived at the time of Darwin, but the theory of Lamarck is mainly based on the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Of course, we never inherit, we know now that we never inherit acquired characteristics. For example, he talked about use and disuse. We all know, for example, that if we use our biceps muscle repeatedly, the biceps muscle will undergo what we call hypertrophy or increase in size due to the increase in the size of the muscle fibers. And if we don't use our muscles, the muscles will undergo atrophy or a diminution in the size of the muscle. This is an acquired characteristic. If you play sports and if you have hypertrophied muscle, this doesn't mean that your offspring will have hypertrophied muscles because this is an acquired characteristic. So we now know that acquired traits or acquired characteristics are not inheritable. Acquired characteristics are not inheritable. Only genetic characteristics are inheritable. We can only inherit traits or characteristics through our genes. Lamarck used his theory in order to interpret or explain why giraffes have long necks. Why giraffes have long necks. I'll erase. So he said that if we have giraffes, for example, started having short necks, and then upon using their necks repeatedly in order to try getting leaves from long trees or high trees, upon repeated use, this is his theory, upon repeated use of their neck muscles, there was elongation of the neck muscles of every individual. And we have said at the beginning of the presentation that evolution is not visualized at the level of an individual. Evolution is visualized at the level of the species and a long period of time. And he also said something incorrect, that this elongation in the neck of the giraffe was passed on to offspring or was inheritable. Okay? Of course, this is absolutely wrong. But what actually happens, in order, Darwin, of course, explained this better. What happens is that there are short-necked, or there were at a certain time in the natural history of Earth, there were short-necked giraffes that were the majority at the beginning, and there were long-necked giraffes that were a minority at the beginning. So the short-necked are the wild type, and they are the original type. When we say wild type, we mean the original type. We mean the non-mutant type. So wild type means non-mutant type. And they were the majority. And then the long-necked ones are the minority, and they were actually the minority, and they were mutant strains. And there should be, every time when you want to explain evolution, there should be an environmental pressure. The environmental pressure in this context was drought, because drought resulted in all the grass and herbs on the surface of Earth to disappear, and only the long trees were surviving. That environmental pressure will do two things. It will select for a certain variant, and it will select against another variant. So of course, in our example, it will select for the long-necked that can reach the trees and select against the short-necked that cannot reach the trees. And this is actually a summary of Darwin's theory. Wallace is a naturalist that published an essay about natural selection that was very similar to that of Darwin's work. And at the time, many people, nobody knew about Darwin, but Wallace did not publish. Wallace was well known, but he did not publish his work on natural selection. At the beginning, when he first wrote it, he did not publish it, but he, no, actually, I'm sorry. Wallace published the essay on natural selection, and it was identical to Darwin's work, and Darwin hadn't yet at the time published his work. But actually, many people credit Wallace along with Darwin for the theory of natural selection, because they both almost said the same thing. Okay? Darwin had a book, or published his book of natural selection, or descent with modification. And by descent, he means descent of the offspring from the ancestors. And by modification, he meant a change. And that paper he published was explaining how, or that paper he didn't publish explained how population evolved. Okay, why didn't he publish it? He didn't publish it because he was afraid that people would be resisting this theory of evolution. And then he finally published the paper, but under the name of On the Origin of Species in 1859. And of course, in his theory on the origin of species, Darwin challenged two ideas that were prevalent at the time, that Earth was young, 6,000 years old only, because some scientists believed in this, and that species were constant and unchanged, like the theory of scala natura. What was the origin of species according to Darwin? So Darwin's theory of natural selection is very easy and sounds logical, but actually we have to say that Darwin concluded this after his visit to the Galapagos Island, and the Galapagos Islands actually, he studied in the Galapagos Islands, he studied a certain species of finches that are now called Darwin's finches. And Darwin's finches were a good example of the adaptive radiation we have just talked about. He visited, actually, he was 22 years old. He visited the Galapagos Islands. He visited South America, Africa, and Australia. And he was a naturalist, meaning that he was based on observation of the behavior of those birds or finches in their natural environment, which is the Galapagos Island. So Darwin's theory of natural selection um, is based on 6 important facts: that populations tend to grow exponentially, very rapidly, that populations or species tend to overpopulate, and when they overpopulate, they exceed their resources. And when they exceed their resources, there will be competition between them. And this competition is, of course, they're all struggling and competing to stay alive. So they are struggling for existence, or they are struggling for staying alive. Meaning that if all the resources are available, populations or species will not put a restriction to their reproduction. They will reproduce exponentially, very rapidly, and continuously. But everything on Earth should be equilibrated. When they overpopulate, they will be faced by a restriction, which is the availability of resources. And they will start struggling for staying alive. Meanwhile, during or while explaining this competition between the living organisms that are overpopulating, Darwin talked about variation. Within the same species, there are variations, there are variants, and therefore, since there is variation, there will be unequal abilities of the individuals to survive and reproduce. So those individuals that will be best adapted for the environment will survive. And if they survive, they reproduce, they pass on their traits to the offspring, and they continue. And those who are not well adapted will not survive and, of course, will not reproduce. What does this mean? This means that the adapted traits are advantageous traits. They represent an advantage, and therefore they will accumulate, they will increase in number, and they will flourish, and the frequency of their alleles will increase. We're going to open a screen in order to summarize all this, in order to summarize Darwin's theory. So he talks about overpopulation, and limited resources. So it's not only overpopulation, but it is overpopulation plus limited resources. So there will be competition to stay alive, competition to stay alive. In that competition, we will have certain environmental stresses. For certain environmental stresses, why are there environmental stresses? As there are variants within each species. There are variants within species. Okay, so there will be 2 possibilities. We have organisms with advantageous adaptive traits, with advantageous, adaptive traits will stay alive and reproduce, will stay alive and reproduce. So if they reproduce, they pass on their traits and continue. They pass on their traits and continue. On the other hand, the organisms, here we will write exactly the opposite, meaning that the organisms with non-advantageous, non-adaptive traits will not stay alive, will not reproduce, will not pass on their traits. So these organisms are selected for, by the environmental stresses, and these organisms are selected against by the environmental stresses. And at the end of the day, there are organisms that increase in number and organisms that decrease in number. So the final result is a change in allele frequency in the population, because it is only the alleles of the adapted organisms, those ones that will stay in the gene pool of the population, and the others will completely disappear. So the conclusion in that, this is what we call natural selection, by the way. So natural selection is a major mechanism in evolution. And natural selection depends on variations, original variations in the phenotypes of the population. And reproductive success is a good measure for evolution. If the organisms are adapted, if the organisms stay alive, if they reproduce, then they pass on their traits and they increase in number. Because if you have reproductive success, then you pass on your traits, you increase in number because you produce offspring. So there is an increase in the number of individuals, and therefore there will be increase in the frequency or the percentage of alleles of those individuals. The only thing that Darwin could not explain is the origin of that variation. And now we understand that the origin of that variation is the frequent or infrequent mutations that occur in organisms. And of course here, according to Darwin's theory, the interpretation of the long neck of the giraffe is totally different. The interpretation is that, as I told you, there are originally the majority of the giraffes that were short-necked and only a minority that were long-necked, but the environmental change, the environmental stress was favorable for, you can say select for, or you can say favorable to those long-necked giraffes, so they could eat, they could reproduce, they could survive, they could reproduce, and they could pass on their traits to the offspring. Of course, Darwin theory was more acceptable than Lamarck's theory. Of course, we can apply that theory of natural selection on resistance to antibiotics or resistance to pesticides. It's the same idea. Antibiotics do not create antibiotics. This is very important. Antibiotics do not create resistant strains, but the resistant strains are already there. The resistant strains are a minority. They are mutant organisms, but when you take the antibiotic or the pesticide, you kill only the sensitive strains and you leave the mutant strains uncompeted, and therefore they flourish, they increase in number, and the prevalence will be to those bacteria, antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So we can similarly open a new screen, and then we will stop there and continue on another video, inshallah. So Similarly, we have a majority of bacteria are sensitive to antibiotics, are sensitive. Am I recording? Yes. So the majority are sensitive to and to a specific antibiotic, to an antibiotic, okay? And only a few mutant strains, they are mutant. The antibiotic did not create the mutation. A few mutant are resistant. And then there is a stress, an environmental stress. There should be a selective pressure. We call the environmental stress, we call it a selective pressure. The environmental stress, which is the antibiotic, will kill those bacteria that are sensitive, but will not be capable of killing the resistant ones. And now the resistant ones have better opportunities because they are now uncompeted, and therefore they flourish, reproduce, and increase in number. Thank you guys. I hope this video was useful, and next time, inshallah, we'll be continuing our study of evolution. Thank you.